We tend to romanticize motivation. We treat it like this magical force that descends upon us and makes hard work feel easy. But scientifically, motivation is often just a fluctuation in the limbic system, the emotional, kind of primitive part of our brain. It's reactive, it's fleeting, it's dependent on sleep, glucose levels, even the weather. Discipline, however, is a function of the prefrontal cortex, our executive center.
Welcome to Resilient Inspirations. Around here, we believe every story carries a lesson, and every question opens a new door. Think of this as friends talking over coffee, exploring ideas together. So let's get started, and I'll pass the mic to the conversation.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we're dissecting one of the most fundamental tensions in the human experience. That conflict between doing what we feel like doing and doing what we know we probably should do. We are wrestling with the discipline versus motivation paradox. The central question is this: is the primary driver of human success, and frankly survival, the emotional spark of motivation, or is it the cold, steady engine of self-discipline?
It's a question that feels personal to pretty much everyone listening, right? Are we supposed to be waiting for inspiration to strike, or are we building the structures that make inspiration, well, almost irrelevant?
And to ground this discussion, we are not just relying on, self-help anecdotes or Instagram platitudes. We are drawing heavily on the landmark Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study. For those who aren't familiar, this was a massive undertaking. Perhaps one of the most significant in psychological history. It followed a cohort of about 1,000 children born in New Zealand in the early 70s, tracking them from birth all the way to their 30s and beyond. And the findings were frankly startling. They found that a simple childhood trait, self-control, predicted physical health, financial stability, and even criminal history better than IQ or social class.
It's an incredible data set. It's so rare to have that level of longitudinal detail where you can see the whole arc of a life unfolding. But how we interpret that data, and more importantly, what we decide to do with it, that's where the battle lines are really drawn.
Exactly. I'm taking the position that self-discipline, and specifically the systems and habits that support the executive function of the brain, is the primary reliable determinant of success. The data shows we need to restructure our lives and maybe even our society to account for the fact that motivation is it's biologically unreliable. We are betting on a resource that simply isn't there when we need it most.
And I'm going to represent the position that discipline, while it's functional, is actually dangerous if it's decoupled from autonomy. I'll argue that intrinsic motivation, the why behind the how, is the essential fuel. Without it, discipline risks becoming what the philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls self-exploitation, or, simply a joyless grind that ultimately fails to produce a meaningful life. We might create efficient workers, but are we creating flourishing humans?
But let me give you a different perspective, one that's really rooted in biology. We tend to romanticize motivation. We treat it like this magical force that descends upon us and makes hard work feel easy. But scientifically, motivation is often just a fluctuation in the limbic system, the emotional, kind of primitive part of our brain. It's reactive, it's fleeting, it's dependent on sleep, glucose levels, even the weather. Discipline, however, is a function of the prefrontal cortex, our executive center. It is the ability to override those limbic impulses.
So you're framing this as a battle between the adult brain and the lizard brain? But is the prefrontal cortex always right? It seems a little reductive to say that our emotional drives are just noise that we have to suppress.
The data suggests suppression, or maybe regulation is a better word, is certainly safer. Look at the Dunedin study findings. They assessed self-control in children as young as age 3. They tracked them for 3 decades. By age 32, the children with the lowest self-control were significantly more likely to have tangible physical health problems, gum disease, systemic inflammation, high cholesterol. They were more likely to have financial struggles, credit card debts, and criminal convictions.
The gum disease correlation is always the one that stops people in their tracks. It just feels so specific, almost random.
But it's not random. That's the point. It represents the mundane reality of discipline. Flossing isn't exciting. You are never motivated to floss. You don't wake up passionate about dental hygiene. You just do it because you have self-control. And here is a crucial part. This wasn't just about kids with clinical issues like ADHD. The study found a gradient effect. At every single incremental step up the ladder of self-control, outcomes improved, health improved, wealth improved. This tells me that we have to stop waiting to feel like doing things. We need to romanticize the system, not the spark.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it reduces the human experience to an input-output machine. Yes, the Dunedin data is compelling, especially with those health metrics, but we have to look at the psychological cost of that gradient. You mentioned the mechanics, but I want to talk about the soul of the machine. If we view discipline as the only metric, we risk creating what Foucault analyzed as internalized societal control. We become our own prison guards.
That seems like a pretty dramatic framing for, paying your bills on time or flossing your teeth.
It sounds dramatic, I know, but consider the concept of the burnout society by Byung-Chul Han. He argues that we've moved from a disciplinary society to an achievement society. If discipline transforms into self-exploitation, where we're constantly whipping ourselves to be more productive, more fit, more wealthy, we burn out. Self-determination theory is very clear on this. Humans have these basic psychological needs for three things: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. If your discipline is controlled, meaning it's forced by external pressure or shame, it is psychologically taxing. It might get you to age 32 with good teeth, sure, but will you be happy?
Well, the study actually touched on that. Those with high self-control reported higher life satisfaction. They weren't miserable robots. They were people whose lives actually worked. They had less stress because they weren't dealing with the chaos of unpaid bills and untreated illnesses.
But the nuance is in the source of that control. If the discipline is autonomous, if it aligns with your identity and your values, then yes, of course it works. But that alignment requires motivation. You need the spark of intrinsic desire to make the engine of discipline run without tearing itself apart. We cannot treat humans as robots to be programmed. Without that spark, the engine is, I think, meaningless.
Let's dig deeper into the Dunedin data, because I think it challenges this idea that this is just about happiness or autonomy. It's about trajectory. One of the most fascinating parts of the research was the sibling comparison. We always hear that success is about poverty or privilege. If you have rich parents, you'll be fine no matter what. That socioeconomic status is destiny. But the researchers looked at 500 sibling pairs. These are kids who shared the same home, the same parents, the same economic background.
Right, effectively controlling for the environment and SES. This is the hardest data to argue against, I'll admit.
Exactly. And even within the same household, the sibling with lower self-control had poor outcomes by age 32. They were more likely to smoke, leave school early, or face addiction issues compared to their more disciplined brother or sister. This proves that self-control is a distinctive active ingredient. It's not just a byproduct of a stable home, because the biological impulse for immediate gratification is just too strong.
That's a compelling argument for the protective nature of discipline. But have you considered the concept of snares? This was a crucial part of the Dunedin analysis that I think changes the narrative entirely. The study suggests that low self-control doesn't magically cause gum disease or poverty. It leads to specific mistakes in adolescence, what the researchers called snares.
You mean specific traps, like dropping out of school or teen pregnancy?
Exactly. Smoking, police records, unplanned pregnancies. These are traps. And the data showed that if you removed these snares, if you could get a low self-control kid through adolescence without them getting pregnant or arrested, the link between their personality and their poor adult outcomes weakens significantly. This tells me that the problem isn't necessarily a lack of internal discipline. It's an environment that sets traps for people who are naturally more impulsive.
But isn't that an argument for discipline? Since we cannot remove every snare from the world, drugs will always exist, distractions will always exist, we must equip the individual with the shield to resist them. The research indicates that early childhood intervention is superior because self-control is, as the researchers noted, malleable. It's a muscle. If we intervene early, we prevent them from ever walking into the snare in the first place. You're asking to child-proof the world. I'm saying we need to world-proof the child.
I think we need to be careful about world-proofing if that just means suppressing natural impulses. But let's look at the mechanism of how we actually do this. You talk about this muscle. The classic view is that willpower is a resource. You use it, it drains, and then you eat the donut.
The ego depletion model, right. It's controversial in psychology right now, I know, but the core truth remains. Willpower is expensive. It costs glucose. It costs mental energy. That is why I argue against relying on feeling like it. The most disciplined people, the ones who look like they have this iron will, they actually use less willpower than everyone else.
Because they aren't fighting the urge constantly?
Because they use environmental design. They don't stare at the phone and use willpower to not pick it up. They put the phone in another room. They don't decide to go to the gym every morning. They lay out their clothes the night before so the decision is already made. They automate the behavior. They remove the option to fail. It's not about moral fortitude. It's about logistics. The person with high self-control isn't a monk. They are just a better architect of their environment.
I agree with design, I really do, but I question the source of the design. If the system is imposed externally, or if you're setting up these rules because you hate yourself or feel you should be better, it breeds resistance. James Clear talks about this in Atomic Habits. He argues for identity-based habits. You don't just set a rule to run, you become the type of person who is a runner.
That sounds a bit like semantics to me. Whether I run because I think I'm a runner or because my alarm clock is across the room, the result is the same. The cardiovascular system doesn't care about your identity, it cares that you ran.
It's not semantics. It's fundamental to sustainability. If you are just following a rule discipline, you are fighting yourself. If you shift your identity, motivation, and internalization, the action becomes natural. You don't need to hide the phone if you are a person who values deep work more than distraction. This requires an internal shift, a motivation shift, not just an external rule.
But you can't just shift identity by wishing it. Action changes identity, not the other way around. Look at the 5-second rule popularized by Mel Robbins. It's a brute force tactic. You have an impulse to act and you move within 5 seconds before your limbic system talks you out of it. You don't wait to feel like a runner. You put on the shoes. The identity follows the discipline. The brain observes the body acting and updates its self-image. Oh, I guess we are running today.
Okay, but that works for a week, maybe a month. The 5-second rule is a tool. A hammer is a great tool, but only if you actually want to build something. If you don't actually want the outcome, if there is no intrinsic motivation, you will eventually stop counting to 5. You will just stay in bed. The tool only works if the why is strong enough to justify the discomfort.
I see your point, but let's scale this up. We're talking about individual success, but the Dunedin study was funded and analyzed with public policy in mind. When we look at the societal level, relying on everyone to find their intrinsic motivation is a disaster strategy. We know humans are biased towards laziness and the path of least resistance.
Laziness is a loaded word. I'd probably say energy conservation.
Call it what you want, but it costs society billions. The study authors explicitly proposed opt-out schemes. This is the nudge theory approach. Since we know motivation fluctuates, the government should make health and savings the default. You are automatically enrolled in a 401k. You have to work hard to not save money. You have to work hard to not eat healthy. This protects the least conscientious among us, the people who, according to the data, cost society the most in crime and healthcare.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that as a solution for human flourishing. It might save money, but it is ethically distinct from actual self-mastery. This is where Foucault's critique hits so hard. If we just design a society of target hardening, making crime impossible, making spending impossible, we are creating moral or disciplined humans. We are creating rats in a maze that has no wrong turns.
And if the rat lives longer and doesn't end up in prison, isn't that a victory? In a modern world defined by sedentary occupations and caloric density, survival requires unnatural self-control. Our biology is outdated. We are wired to seek sugar and rest. If we don't impose external discipline through policy or strict personal systems, our biology will kill us.
It might keep us alive, but for what? To be productive workers? I would frame it differently. We should focus on what researchers call harmonious passion. This is doing things because we love them and they integrate into our lives rather than obsessive passion, which is controlled by the outcome. If we simply nudge and force people into good behavior, we strip them of the very autonomy that makes life worth living. We need to teach people how to cultivate the desire for the good, not just force the good upon them.
I think we're conflating two things here, the initial action and the long-term goal. This brings us to the distinction between self-control and grit. The research by Angela Duckworth and others highlights that these are related, but they're separable. You can have high self-control, you resist the cookie, you pay the bill, but lack grit, which is the pursuit of a superordinate goal over decades.
That's a very important distinction.
It is. Because while grit is great for exceptional achievement, winning a Nobel Prize, becoming an Olympian, self-control is the baseline for a functional life. You can be gritty and still be a total mess in your daily habits. But the Dunedin data shows that the daily habits, the discipline, are what keep you out of the danger zone. You don't need grit to floss your teeth, you need self-control. And it's the lack of flossing, figuratively speaking, that ruins lives.
I agree, but I'd actually use that to prove my point. The marshmallow test view of the world pathologizes spontaneity. Someone might fail the self-control test in the moment. They eat the cookie, they check Instagram, but they might possess incredible grit toward a passion that really matters to them. If we optimize purely for self-control, we might squeeze out the creative, chaotic energy that drives innovation. We shouldn't pathologize everyone who fails to act like a perfectly rational economic agent all the time.
But the data doesn't show that the chaotic, low self-control people are winning Nobel Prizes. It shows they are struggling with addiction and poverty.
In the aggregate, yes, of course. But we are talking to individuals here. And for the individual, the message, just have more discipline, is often counterproductive. It leads to shame spirals. I failed to control myself, therefore I am bad. If we shift the focus to what motivates me, what do I value, the discipline often follows naturally without all the shame.
Let's bring this to a close because I think we've identified the core tension. My position stands. Motivation is a great starter fluid, but it burns off. It is biologically unreliable. The pain of discipline is cheaper than the pain of regret. We see from the Dunedin study that the trajectory of a life is determined by the ability to manage impulses. We need that 1-2 punch of early childhood intervention and adolescent protection to save the next generation from those snares. We must build the systems that make willpower unnecessary.
And I will maintain that discipline is necessary, but it has to be integrated. It cannot be a cage we build for ourselves. The ideal progression is motivation leading to discipline, which eventually settles into habit. But we have to be wary of the over-control trap where life becomes rigid and devoid of spontaneity. We are not just trying to survive the gradient, we are trying to live.
There is one thing we undeniably agree on, which the research highlights beautifully: neuroplasticity.
Absolutely. The brain can change. The Dunedin study showed that people did change their rank. Some people with low self-control as kids learned it later in life and improved their outcomes.
Exactly. Discipline is not a fixed genetic trait like eye color. It is a muscle. It can be strengthened through practice.
And through changing your environment and your mindset.
So to our listeners, we suggest you examine your own life. Are you sitting on the shore waiting for a wave of motivation that, might not come?
Or are you building a system that allows you to swim even when the water is calm?
Thank you for joining the debate.
That wraps up today's journey. Thanks to my friends for sharing their thoughts, and to you for being part of this circle. Remember, inspiration isn't found once. It's built every day in small choices. If this talk spoke to you, share it, follow along, and let's keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired.